American lawyer Alfred Maurice De Zayas, born in Cuba not long after the Second World War. Who is this fellow? He's a historian and a lawyer. His field would be international law and human rights. He's done a lot of work for the UN. He's a writer and lecturer. He also has Swiss nationality now. Anyway, he advocates for the establishment of a UNPA, which stands for United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, a world parliament. And he also wants a world court on human rights, two things I definitely support. I think his official title for a few years was UN Independent Expert on the Promotion of a Democratic and Equitable International Order, but he's retired now, I understand. Last year, he handed in his 7th and final report to the UN's Human Rights Council at the body's 37th session in Geneva, where he covers a lot of ground in the report, from social responsibility of corporations to military expenditure, to the obligations of intergovernmental bodies. Talking about the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, he called for a limitation of veto powers, saying, quote, "The use of the veto power to shield states from criticism or sanctions is illegitimate." And not for the first time, he raised the idea of a parliamentary world assembly. In his words, "The idea is to address democracy deficits by giving expression to global public opinion and including citizens in global decision-making through elected officials. In a time where we see less connection between the will of peoples and the policies put forward in their name, the world's citizens need representation on the global stage. Democratic initiatives, including the proposal to create a World Parliamentary Assembly, would include all citizens in global decision-making and give voice to currently neglected global public opinion." End quote. Of course, there are strong forces which will resist with everything in their arsenal the spread of democracy. There are clearly rich and powerful elites who benefit greatly from the status quo. Then you have to deal with unfortunately uninformed members of the public. Yeah, we have to find a way for this idea to hit the main vein, be front and centre in political discussions. Right now, the idea is essentially where it was 5 or 10 years ago, namely on the margins, supported by, a few former and current parliamentarians and diplomats. I think the Dalai Lama is on board also, that's great. Yeah, it's spoken about here and there in the UN and perhaps also at the EU. I know there is support for the idea of a world parliament in India, also great. The UN has a role to play in this, and there are tremendous people working for the organisation, but the UN itself is kind of a dinosaur, as I've said before, and it seems immune to significant reform. Even though it's called for, this reform, by various member states, we seem stuck. So although the UNPA campaign is useful and admirable, it can and does draw attention and create discussion, that's good, but I don't believe this campaign will lead to the creation of a body which is truly needed, namely a global parliament with real legislative powers and thus the ability to really change the world. It would be a welcome and positive thing to see national leaders supporting a big change to the international order, but sometimes leaders themselves need to be led. I support the internet referendum on creating a democratic world parliament because, in the basic sense, this has to be a bottom-up movement, or grassroots if you like. Or in reality, many grassroots movements coming together to push it forward, to get the thing into an area where a wider and wider audience is being reached, and find creative ways to keep the momentum going. Not easy by any stretch of the imagination. The challenge of a lifetime for many people. Interesting footnote on Mr. De Zayas. He was perhaps the first American historian to publish on the taboo subject of the expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from the East in the 1940s, which is not something you hear much about in my country, at least. There is an awareness, but other events happening around that time tend to dominate the historical narrative.